Welcome to the last episode for fall 2020 of our perambulations in various fields of modern Greek studies, conversations about Greece, featuring our very own Johanna Hanink in a discussion with Vangelis Calotychos and yours truly. I am Elsa Amanatidou, and together with Vangelis, Johanna, Yannis Hamilakis, Graham Oliver, and Eleni Sikelianos, we are Modern Greek Studies at Brown University. Today's webinar will be structured as follows. First, Vangelis Calotychos will talk with Johanna Hanink about her forthcoming translation of Andreas Karkavitsas' novel, The Archeologist, written in 1903 and published in 1904. In the second part, the discussion will go backwards and turn to Λόγια της Πλώρης, Tales from the Prow, and I will be talking to Johanna about the process of translation and the place of these stories in world literature. Throughout this conversation, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we promise to pass these on to Johanna to address, so you don't need to wait until the end. A few words about today's speakers. Vangelis Calotychos is visiting associate professor in comparative literature and modern Greek studies, as well as a legend in our field with books such as Greece, A Cultural Poetics, and The Balkan Prospect, Identity, Culture and Politics in Greece after 1989. For all the students out there, make sure you check out his courses for spring 2021, and I apologize for plugging. The two courses are Greeks on the Silver Screen and a new course, hot off the press, Reading the Short Story. Our guest of honor needs no introduction, but please indulge me as I enumerate just a few of her remarkable achievements. Johanna's scholarly and intellectual pursuits can be summed up in her own words as Greece this, Greece that. Her work centers on Greece, ancient and modern, with a few stops in between. Among her publications, her latest, How to Think About War, an Ancient Guide to Foreign Policy, came out in 2019 by Princeton University Press, and before that, The Classical Debt, Greek Antiquity in an Era of Austerity, a volume co-edited with Richard Fletcher, Creative Lives in Classical Antiquity, Poets, Artists, and Biography, as well as Lycurgan Athens and the Making of Classical Tragedy. I am delighted to welcome my two friends, my two very good friends and awesome scholars to today's webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Elsa, and thank you for organizing this series of conversations in the fall. I'm particularly pleased to be able to participate in this conversation with my colleague, Johanna Hanink, and I'm particularly delighted to be discussing her attempts to showcase works of modern Greek literature to a much broader audience. I should say that one of her predecessors in the classics department here at Brown, William Wyatt, who some of you may remember fondly, was also a translator of the same author, Andreas Karkavitsas, and perhaps a more well-known work, The Beggar, or Zitianos. He also, I noticed today, wrote an article on The Archeologist, which is the work that Johanna has been working with and is sharing with us today. Anyway, it's no small feat, and it's a difficult feat to carve out a space for these works of modern literature. Indicatively, William Wyatt's translation, wonderful translation of short stories by Yorgos Vizinos, is unfortunately out of print. So we all need to rally around and support these labors of love that bring modern Greek fiction of the late 19th century and 20th century to a wider audience. Johanna, I was going to begin by asking you simply why Andreas Karkavitsas, and how it came about that you were asked to, or you proposed, a translation of his work.
Thank you, Vangelis, and thank you, Elsa, for all that you've done for all of this organization. This has just been such a spectacular series. Well, of course, it started with Elsa. How could it not have? Elsa, I sort of offhandedly, now that our offices are next to each other, back when we could see each other in person, sort of mentioned that she was reading The Archeologist with one of our graduate students, who's Christopher Dotishki Hall, who I believe is probably here. And she said, you should really take a look at this. It touches on all of the issues that you wrote about in Classical Debt. Which I have to say, Classical Debt, one of the things that it came under some fire for in reviews was being light on the literary side. And I think that was sort of me feeling like a literature person trying to overcompensate and speak more to historical sources. But so it must have been about Christmas time last year that I started reading The Archeologist, and I knew from the first paragraph that I wanted other people to read it because I wanted to talk about it with other people who might not have as a great degree of comfort reading modern Greek. And I was just so really bewitched by the language, that the way that the story begins allegorically as this kind of this fairy tale. I mean, it's written in a demotic, but it's one that's really sort of evocative of, it sort of combines both modernist description with these sort of fairy tale tropes. And there's almost this kind of magical realism feel to the way that the passing of time is narrated and the sort of plot unfolds. And there was just something I found so utterly charming and vivid about the language. And it wasn't even until later that I as I read more and more about Karkavitsas, that I was, came to understand that in his own day, he has been so famous for his descriptive capacities. So it was just sort of immediately, I knew that I wanted to make it available to a wider audience, largely so that I could talk about it with more people.
You capture there its place, or the place of some of Karkavitsas' writing at that time, when there was a concerted attempt to graft elements of folklore and popular tradition into a foreign form, foreign at least in the way it was appearing in Greece in the 19th century, which of course was the novel. I wonder if you had something to say about that process within the book, and perhaps in terms of your own translation of that interface.
Well, yeah, I think so. Karkavitsas was in the same intellectual circle as Politis, as the founder of the sort of, what people call modern Greek folklore studies of Laographia. Politis went on to he was Karkavitsas' editor. And actually some of Karkavitsas, and we'll get to this when we talk about Tales from the Prow, Logetis Ploris, some of Karkavitsas' work actually enters into the Politis sort of canon of here are our folk tales. So there's this kind of very much this back and forth between the two of them. But at the same time, as you have this growing interest in, Laographia, you also have the influx, the sort of really avid translation of works of sort of naturalism and realism coming in from Russia and France, or really sort of, translations of Russian works are being done from the French translations, not directly from the Russian. But you have, I think those are that's the confluence of two traditions that is really important and gives you, what some people sort of controversially call ethographia, but it's something that kind of goes to the next level then in the Archeologist, which I think it sort of kind of gobbles up some of those naturalistic tendencies, but really focuses more on the sort of folkloristic aspects of things. And I have to say that as someone who has always sort of really loved folklore and fairy tales and those kinds of things. One of the things, and Vangelis is speaking to your question about translation, one of the pleasures of translating this text was the ability to sort of write these words that I never get, in sort of academic life to write, that I don't get to use in my own writing, but to draw on a kind of like fairy tale vocabulary to talk about princes and princesses and these sorts of things. It just becomes, I think as a translator, it's such a pleasure to be able to, sort of write words, in the extract I'll read like honeysuckle. It's just not a word that I sort of write down that often.
Right.
And so that was part of, again, the charm of it was that idiom.
Right. Now, you mentioned in passing that we sort of touched base earlier today that Karkavitsas did not have any other languages other than Greek. And yet, how would you place the work in relationship to that broader field of literature? I mean, what kind of reverberations does it have for you? Other conscious ones that he may have worked on, or ones that you think are important to kind of contextualize the work for a penguin audience, let's say?
Yeah, so it is a sort of oft-repeated refrain that he had in other languages. So I think he made some attempts at French at some point. I don't know how far he got, but I think we can assume that he's not working directly with other literary traditions in other languages. But one thing that I think, and maybe I'll just say very quickly for those who don't know, that the Archeologist is a tale of two brothers. And their family, the Eumorphopoulos family, stands in as an allegory for the Greek people. And this is set in the generation really after Greek has won independence from the Ottoman Empire. And you have two brothers who are sort of diametrically opposed to their visions for how Greece should be reborn. So one, the titular archaeologist, is very much more in this kind of Western classical tradition where he thinks that, the past should be excavated, the old language should be spoken, and so on and so forth. Or the other brother, Dimitrakis, is sort of more represents this kind of folk tradition, the Romaic kind of strand of things, if you want to look at a Romaic Hellenic binary. And so I think that one, place you can go with the Archeologist, and, in most of the handbooks, people sort of mostly focus on where it fits into Greek literary history, is to look at a broader interest in the Victorian era, the late Victorian era, and the sort of entering into the early 20th century in ruins, in archaeology. We have Egyptomania. We have a kind of real fascination with the past. I mean, you can sort of do a tour of Europe and the Mediterranean at this point. You have the Cambridge Ritualists. You have Jane Harrison sort of going up in Cambridge. You have also, in the year that the Archeologist is published, that's the year that Sigmund Freud famously makes his visit to Athens and has what he then later refers to as that disturbance of memory on the Acropolis. And I think that this is one sort of context in which this work of Karkavitsas is not nearly enough positioned, is in this sort of growing field of psychoanalysis, which Freud very explicitly characterizes as a kind of archaeology of the self, which I think is really literalized in the titular archaeologist in the Karkavitsas novel, in his attempts to sort of excavate who he is, who his family is, by digging through the layers of the soil. So I think that these are these other kinds of strains that you could look at very generatively, is the sort of emergence of Freudian psychoanalysis in this period, and then also the kind of general mania for antiquities, for novels about ruins, novels about archaeology.
In terms of excavating into the soil to discover the self, I wonder if in a kind of analogy, there's a sense in which your copious reference to footnotes and to the task of uncovering typologies and historical, classical, Byzantine archetypes, reference, etc., plays the role of a kind of play of the unconscious within modern Greek tradition. I mean, how important was that as a kind of choice for you as a translator or editor of your own work to explore that to the degree that you do, to the great degree that you do in the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that even though my translation, I meant it to be very kind of transparent and accessible, I went with the Nabokov sort of footnotes approach, which is they are copious, and I think that there is this effort with the notes to well, I mean, I come from a field of classics, which is very, very incredibly exegetical. But to be able to sort of expose the references, it's such an allegorical novel. I mean, every character, sort of every plot turn is really sort of built off of, you know, events, sort of canons of common knowledge, references to literature, that I think that, you know, to really kind of fully appreciate the story that's being told, or sort of really the point of view that's being foisted upon you, you do have to kind of get at least a sense of you know, when something is being quoted as a piece of classical literature, when there is an allusion to, you know, the war in 1897. I think that these things need to kind of be brought to the surface in order to appreciate the text. And I think that is, you know, in a way, as you suggest, Vangelis kind of, you know, mirrors a lot of what goes on in modern Greek studies, where this constant archaeology of Hellenism and so on and so forth.
Right. I wonder what the archaeology is for the other character, the other brother, the one who is more representative of the present and the potential future of a modern Greek reality. I think many people would be able to imagine in their mind's eye the archaeology for the classicizing brother Aristodemus, but for his brother Dimitrakis, how would you sketch his own archaeology of self? Or shouldn't I be using that word archaeology in his case?
I think in his case you can, and this is, you know, something I talk about in the introduction, is that we're not so far, and sorry, this is a little bit inside baseball for people who, you know, haven't done much with modern Greek studies, but this work, I think, is very much steered and shaped by historiographical approaches that had developed in the mid-19th century in Greece, by, you know, Zabelios, by Paparigopoulos, where you have a real kind of Hegelian notion of the evolution of Greek history, where you have antiquity as a kind of thesis in a way, sort of Byzantium as the antithesis, and then you get the synthesis in modernity. And so I think actually that it's sort of overly facile, as I myself did, to position Aristodemus and Dimitrakis as really kind of these opposites to each other, because what I argue in my introduction is that the real kind of antiquity, you know, thesis is Aristodemus, whereas it's this woman Elpida who comes in and really represents this kind of you know, laic Byzantine sort of tradition. And then in Dimitrakis, eventually he becomes this kind of synthesis of the two. And that's where the book ultimately leads. And I hope it's not too much of a spoiler, but he realizes that the true path forward is a real organic marriage of some of the spirit of ancient Hellenism with the kind of more modern or sort of subsequent Byzantine and so on, the Christian Orthodox tradition. No, so archaeology is important to him in the end. He comes to appreciate the marbles. So
I'm going to go on to this figure Elpida in a moment and talk about her a little bit together. But before that, I just wanted to ask for your comment, and I found a particularly interesting element of your presentation of this work is the concern for that very specific historical moment at the time of writing, 1903, 1904, coming on the heels of a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Ottoman Turks in 1897, and the brewing conflict in the geographical area of Macedonia. One of the metaphors, if you will, that it casts itself against the contending metaphor of excavation of the soil is actually the kind of agricultural and cooperative working of the soil to make the soil productive. And in that, there is a kind of extended metaphor that plays out and in quite nationalistic terms expresses a position around Greek expansionism, Greece's place in the Balkans. And you make me understand that there's a territorial interest in this work, and Dimitrakis kind of yokes together this kind of interest in agriculture and controlling the earth and applying it to a larger kind of political message.
Yeah, so there's sort of two main thematic currents in this. So there's the one is the sort of antiquity and the role of antiquities in the identity of the sort of the Greek state. But the other then is really Vangelis, these issues that you raise around what eventually becomes known as the Macedonian struggle, sort of the final carving up of the Ottoman Empire, what territorial gains are to be made. I mean, you mentioned Karkavitsas' Zitianos, the beggar, earlier, which is also very sort of geographically rooted in the annexation of Thessaly to the nation state, which had happened sort of not long before. And here now, I mean, I think really the message of this is that that Karkavitsas is trying to push is that if people just sort of focus too much on digging up things, which was, I mean, I failed to say that this is just an absolute boom time for Greek archaeology, whether you want to talk about the Germans in Olympia, the French in Delphi and Delos, just sort of everywhere, all these foreigners are coming in and digging things up. But I think the real message here is that if people just sort of focus too much on the past and what's underneath the soil in this very restricted, circumscribed area, that sort of modernity is going to pass them by. And these other Balkan peoples, primarily the Bulgarians, who are sort of embodied by this foil character of Petros Theomisitos, but also the Serbians, the Romanians, right? Even the Ottomans to a certain extent, that they are going to sort of edge Greece out of having any importance in the Balkan Peninsula. Right. And so the real kind of, I think, historical interest of this novel today is also that, I mean, and Karkavitsas had no way of knowing this at the time, but what he's done is he's allegorized through these sort of different characters and peoples and sort of geographical and agricultural narratives is the Balkan Peninsula's real status as this powder keg of Europe at this time, that these are the tensions that, find themselves as plot points in this novella, but then eventually sort of spill over and are real drivers for the outbreak of World War I.
Right. It seems to me there's also a message of kind of self-reliance there, that the archaeological narrative requires excavating and finding things which will allow for the great powers to intervene on Greece's behalf. Karkavitsas in some ways says that narrative is over or is suspect, and that we need to move on into actually fashioning the landscape around us with our own dynamism. And in that, it seems to one particularly interesting polarity that I saw in the work was that the archaeological, let's say, pole is presented in terms of sophistry, and that the other pole is one of soldiery, of military potential. But if we just move on for a second, because I want to pass on to Elsa in a bit. You said that the let's say this other polarity also depends on a fusion with the meaning assigned to Elpida, who is the love interest for Dimitrakis, and she connotes a whole slew of other meanings and traditions, etc. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on her role in this kind of format.
Right, so she's Dimitrakis' love interest, and she occupies this kind of complex allegorical space because her mother was raped by a member of the Khan family who stands in for the Ottoman Turks. And so Aristodemus looks down upon her as not a true Eumorphopolis, but rather as this kind of bastardized blood whom he repudiates. And over time, it comes to be clear that, and even the foreigners, the foreigners who kind of represent these outside archaeologists and philologists who come into Greece, they even kind of start to advise Aristodemus that, you need to pay more attention to Elpida. This is where your future is. And so she has a very interesting relationship, in particular with the mother of the two brothers, with Mrs. Panoria, who really, as the book moves on, I think you come to understand that it wasn't her son, that it wasn't Aristodemus who truly represented antiquity, but Mrs. Panoria who represented the real virtuous, emulable spirit of ancient Hellenism. And these two women really have a very, even intimate relationship between the two of them that goes on when no men are present sort of in the frame, as it were.
Are you intending to read a short section for us from that encounter?
Yes, I am so intending.
How did I know that?
I thought you would never ask. Well, so I have this reading of this, which I think is a little bit out there, but I'm kind of convinced that it's right, where what happens is that eventually Mrs. Panoria and Dimitrakis are so fed up with what Aristodemus is doing, ripping up the family land, that they leave and they go to Elpida's house, and I'm very convinced that her house is on Mount Olympus. It's at the border of the Khan family and the Eumorphopolis family territories, which Mount Olympus is right at this time. So they arrive, Mrs. Panoria, the mother, and Dimitrakis arrive in really bad condition up at the top of the mountain. Right. And Mrs. Panoria, actually, she's sort of on her last legs, as it were, by the time she gets up there. And if you remember that, I think she represents the true spirit of ancient Hellenism in the scene that I'm about to read. So in this scene, then Elpida is going to tend to her. And you're going to see here a very kind of typical Karkavitsas kind of catalog of objects or images in this case that is really meant to kind of stand in for an entire tradition, which in this case is the laic kind of folk tale tradition, which is represented in the objects and images in Elpida's humble room. Okay. So they entered the room and the old woman entrusted herself to the girl's care. She was, in truth, very tired. Sorrow and weariness quarreled on her face, making it severe but endearing. She sat on the sofa, rested her head in her hand, and looked around at the heirlooms with pleasant surprise. Across from her, the white-sheeted bed looked like a blooming honeysuckle bush. In a corner stood a loom with a half-woven cloth, and next to it was the skein winder, ready to turn the gold thread. On the wall hung the bow loom and a lyra. The bow loom was for the girl's cotton weaving, cotton for clothing, and the lyra for songs of woe, of desire, and passion. The other walls were adorned with drawings, antique but wholly vibrant, as if the pen had been lifted from them only just now. One showed Arethusa in prison, showering tears upon Erotokritos' ring. In another, Arodaphnusa suffered the blistering anger of the queen, and farther off the king was brandishing his sword, ready to cut his jealous wife to pieces. In another, the pretty shepherdess was wasting away in her flower-strewn cave, yearning for the nameless shepherd. And others depicted other sufferings, tender love stories with unhappy endings, as if the room were the temple of some fearsome god. Inextinguishable desire and pale green jealousy, together with deception and black contempt, scattered their victims like cut lilies here and there. And their victims were fair maids and longed-for youths, and their suffering was the suffering of a butterfly. Mrs. Panoria gazed at the pictures, and sorrow swept over her brow. Elpida stood before her as she combed her silver hair and looked down at her without daring interrupt her thoughts. She then wanted to get the aged woman out of her wet clothes. She opened the armoire and took snow-white linens out of it. A strong scent of lavender mixed with amaranth issued forth and filled the room as if an incense censer had been lit. Mrs. Panoria perceived the scent and smiled. Elpida became flustered. She thought she was smiling at the humbleness of the linens. "What can I do, my lady?" she said, all red like a rose. "I know that my linens aren't worthy of your body, but I have no others. If I'd known that God would bring you to be dressed by me so soon, I'd have woven you cloth from the sun's own grace. But I wasn't expecting it, and I'll have to make do for you." "It matters not, my girl, it matters not," said the old woman with a kind-hearted voice. "Clothes do not make the man. The man makes the clothes, I know. And on your body, my own humble garments will become the virgin chemise." As she helped Mrs. Panoria get changed, her hands trembled with emotion. For the first time, her eyes beheld the shapely body, its skin pale as ivory. Her crystal neck with its azure veins, her ripened breasts and rounded flanks called to mind nature herself with her fiery juices. Elpisa involuntarily thought of Aristodemus, and melancholy washed over her like a wave off a calm sea. What a swift curse has fallen upon her house, she thought. A womb made by God's own hand to bear strong children with the bodies of gods. Why on earth had she been reduced to giving birth to such miseries?
Yeah, I mean, I was glad. I was trying to remember this. The last paragraph that you read seems very important to me, because Panoria is a kind of sign for the classical tradition, but here she's pitched as being very natural, which Elpida is as well, and that restituting nature and the power of nature and the beauty of nature, because there seems to be an attraction to the older woman's body.
I totally agree.
Very
Yes.
good.
I totally agree.
I'm going to sign off just simply by emphasizing the fact that we've been very much rooted in the land, rooted in territory and earth and nature. And I'm going to pass it on to Elsa, who's going to discuss with Johanna his short stories, which are mixed metaphor, rooted in the sea.
Anchored in the sea.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vangelis. And Johanna, before we move on, we back in time to 1899. Would you perhaps entertain a question about the archaeologist so that we transition more smoothly?
Sure.
Okay, so the question comes from Christopher. And as expected, Christopher, do you think the novel makes a statement about the museum and museumification of Greece? Aristodemos' marbles are the obvious example, but can the heirlooms in Elpida's room also be read as a museum of Greek folk culture?
I think so very much, and this is a time where you have the folk museums sort of start. I mean, if you've ever been to, at loose ends on a Greek island of a summer, the folk museums with the handicrafts in them. This particular this setting at Elpida's house, there are so many scenes of ekphrasis. There are catalogs of the kinds of crafts that they produce up there, of the wooden handicrafts. And there's a really extended ekphrasis of an embroidery, which is very important to the story here, that depicts basically all of sort of Greek history, since antiquity, after antiquity, upon it. So I think, yeah, absolutely, you have a sort of real interest at this time in the creation of collections. And this is something that's very developed in sort of classical scholarship, the way that, texts themselves become collections. And I think that this is one of the things that the archaeologist is doing, is trying to represent all this history through these aggregates of images and material objects. So, yeah.
So I am going to move to Log Exploris, which came out in 1899. And I'll start off with a two-pronged question, Johanna, and one of those links to a little bit to Christopher's question. So as you mentioned, Karkavitsas was a doctor. He went around the country collecting stories and folklore tales, and he meticulously jotted all those down in his little notebook. And in one of his diaries, once he wrote something, I'm going to paraphrase now because I'm relying on memory. Η πηγή είναι ο λαός μας, όχι οι αρχαίοι, όχι τα βιβλία, όχι οι ξένοι. So in other words, we should be drawing from our folk tales, not from the ancients, not from books, and not from the foreigners. So you chose to translate those stories. Why should an American audience be interested in those stories? And also, why Logia Exploris? Why Tales from the Prow? So if you can situate us a little bit in this.
Well, the passage that you were just quoting, Elsa, too, I love, because I think it's in that same passage that he says, why do we need to go far afield to search for our inspiration when, like, at our feet lie, diamonds and rubies that we can just sort of pick up for ourselves right here. This will to sort of speak to a question that I saw pop up in the chat, which I'm sorry I'm not keeping as close an eye on as I could be, but about the reception of the archaeologist in its own time. The archaeologist was marked, it really drew a line under the Karkavitsas' creative days. It was not well received. He had taken a sort of fairly nationalistic, kind of odd turn after archaeologist. He really just went on to putting together school readers for kids to sort of indoctrinate them in these kinds of Greek stories. It was regarded as the allegory was sort of very thin. It didn't have the richness of characterization that people had come to expect, not only from Ligeri, from the people, the fair maid, I think is how Beaton translates, or the winnowy girl or something. But then especially in Zitianos, which was just been such a masterpiece that the archaeologists kind of, went over like a lead balloon after Zitianos. So I did want to give I went to Logia Exploris for a couple of reasons. I wanted to give readers a sense of Karkavitsas at what his contemporaries had thought him at his best, really at the height of his storytelling powers. And I also wanted to give a little bit of a contrast, because the archaeologist seems so situated, so local in Greece. But Logia Exploris really, I think, gives you much more of a sense of Karkavitsas in this kind of, what Maya Jasanoff has said for Joseph Conrad, in the global world. That this sort of maritime travel, these maritime communities, there's much more of a framework of world literature that you can situate him in with these stories, which are also, just really, so much fun, such sort of perfectly crafted objects, textual objects in a way. I wanted to give that sense of contrast.
Thank you. And I'm just reading the chat, and there's a question by Nicholas Kakufa, and I am going to use Nicholas's question because it overlaps with what I was going to ask you next. So thank you, Nicola. Great friends think alike. That's all I can say. So the archaeologist is considered by many Karkavitsas' contribution to the language issue in Greece at the beginning of the century. Dimaras, in particular, in his History of Greek Literature, accuses Karkavitsas that he's actually using this and its language as part of the demotic renovation project for Greek society, calling it a poor analogy. How important is this language issue in your translation, especially if we accept the fact that this exact language was part of the book's ideological project? So the question is there, it's a long one, so you can read it. And to this, I am going to perhaps tag my own question about language, which is, in particular, in relation to Logia Exploris, what are the factors that weighed in your decision to adopt a certain linguistic idiom over another? In addition to, the nautical terminology, there is a particular language register that is employed, which is very historically embedded. So how did you tackle that? So it's a two-pronged question about language.
See, it's hard to avoid the nautical puns with the tackle. So in terms of tackle, I think, okay, so to go to the glossiko zitima, thank you, Nicola. So Karkavitsas is very much associated with the Demotic movement. Zitianos was the first book in Demotic. It was the first published novel in Demotic. However, he really opposed himself to, he thought that Psycharis was kind of ridiculous. He thought that there was a way that you could kind of take the pendulum too far and have this kind of very artificially constructed demotic for the sake of demonicness. So the language that he uses, actually, I have to say, it's kind of accessible because he thinks what he's doing is using sort of what's most organically his idiom. And that's really the critique of, people who would sort of tend towards Karkavitsas in the Archeologist, is that Aristodemus, as much as he's trying to speak like his ancestors, there's this paragraph that I won't try to find right now, but where it says, but whenever he got angry, whenever he was sad, whenever he wanted to yell at someone or whisper sweet nothings, it was his own language that came out. And so this was this idea that Karkavitsas felt that when he wrote Ligeri, when he had written these other things in Karkavitsas, that he had been writing in this kind of unnatural straitjacket that had stood in the way of what he wanted to say. So he's really just sort of using demotic in as much, even though he is polemical about being a demoticist, but he's not so extreme as someone like a Psycharis. And what he just really wants to do is to document how people authentically spoke, right? And so to create new coinages in demotic is also not how people authentically speak. So on this count, I find him very similar, I would have to say, to someone who like Mark Twain, who's a regionalist, who's really interested in documenting kind of this sort of authentic idiom of the people. And that's then what you get in Loietis Ploris, which I'll say that even now it's considered second to Zitianos in terms of its status as a masterpiece. At the time, it was also greatly criticized because it was in Demotic. Mm-hmm. Right? But in this case where you have this sort of maritime idiom, it becomes sort of so full of borrowings from Italian, from Turkish, from Arabic. It's this really sort of transnational idiom that I have to say made it at some points, especially with toponyms, names of winds, it made it kind of a very challenging to translate, or sort of, technical terminology for what's going on the boat and the rigging, the tackle, these kinds of things.
Yeah, and of course, I am going to ask you how you overcame that challenge, clearly. But also in relation to the negative reception of Loietis Ploris by some, of course, it was criticized for being in the demotic, but also Psycharis criticized it for not being demotic enough, or generally Karkavitsas' work. So how did you overcome this challenge? What was the process? What was your, measure for knowing when to gloss, when to provide maps, drawings, footnotes?
Right. Yeah, I mean, what I did is I basically wanted, because I wanted the Loietis Ploris to enter into a kind of dialogue with this boom in sea literature from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What I did was I spent a lot of time reading sea stories from that period and trying as much as I could to kind of recreate that idiom. So in terms of my production in my own language, I tried to read as much as possible in sea stories. In terms of sort of just decipherment, I sort of had to say I crowdsourced some questions which had mixed results, but a lot of it, I wound up in sort of nautical dictionaries. A lot of it just required some, a lot of kind of logical thinking through, right? Also, we had that whole conversation about figuring out what potamos, what their destination in one of the stories is in Doomed, figuring out that this was Odessa, where the river. Mm-hmm. So it required some sort of historical detective work, help from friends, but I have to say through Google Books is just spectacular, the amount of resources from precisely this period that you can access directly. So nautical, Gallo-Greek, Gallo-Hellenic, I guess, nautical dictionaries from about 1900 is now something you can just, find online.
That's true. And in relation to that, Johanna, and in relation to Greece this, Greece that, you're trained as a classicist. Mm-hmm. How did this prepare you for this task? Has it prepared you for this task? Is it an advantage?
I think that I do think it was an advantage, and I do have to say, I think it was an advantage in approaching this author, because this author was someone who himself had a classical, I guess what we would call a classical education. He was so immersed in this literature that I think it helps, really for any intellectuals of the 19th century, especially elite intellectuals or people who are highly educated. it helps you get inside their heads a little bit and understand kind of what they've, been trained on. So for example, in one of the stories that I translated from Tales from the Prow, sponge divers, I mean, I am very convinced that there's a very clear Iliadic reference that comes early and it comes hard. And I think it's really meant to sort of frame the entire story, even though it's just sort of one throwaway line. And I think that, without having that kind of background, I would have kind of missed a trick in that story. I would have appreciated it less.
Great. A little more that connects your modern Greek translation with your training as a classicist and your translations of ancient works. So we have a question from another one of our students, Megan, who is asking, can you tell us a little more about your principles or methods of translation? Did you approach this translation differently from the way that you approached your translation of Thucydides' speeches?
Yeah, that's a great question, very much so. So the big difference here is that, these works have not been translated into English in a published form. I think that there might be some rough Logetis Ploris kind of floating around in the depths of the internet or something. But I mean, my method for this was really, I would have a go at it. And then I was working with a wonderful PhD student at the University of Chicago, Christina Filippaki, who she would help with places that I got really stuck. Elsa, we had supervisions all the time. I asked you several questions. But unlike with Thucydides, ultimately there's no crutch. You can't check anywhere. And so there was some work of interpretation with it. And then for me as a translator, I was just, I wanted to produce something that was a good and accessible read. And so my translations tend to go through, 10, 15, 20 drafts, where usually the first thing I come up with is just kind of getting the basic sense on the page, and then it takes kind of constant, like I always think of the carding of wool to sort of straighten it out, get rid of the errors, make it smooth and pretty, draft by draft by draft by draft.
Right. Another question came in. I'm going to read it in a minute, and let me ask you about the Tales from the Prow, and why those particular 4 stories. In particular, why the Gorgon?
Well, the Gorgon is a story that is about an encounter between a sailor and the mythical Gorgon, who in the Greek folklore tradition had been the sister of Alexander the Great, who drank the immortal water, and now she roams the waves, and if she meets a sailor, she asks if Alexander still lives, and he has to answer in a very, very specific way. So, Zik Vasilevi Keton Kosmo Kirievi, which I have is, yes, he lives and he reigns and the world is his domain. Mm-hmm. And if you don't answer like that, she, sinks your ship. And so I used that story, which is very familiar to people sort of with familiarity with Greek culture or the Greek folk tradition. It's a very short story. It's a bridge between the Archeologist and the Tales from the Prow, because you have a kind of moment of reception of antiquity in a way that I think, and I have problems with this term, but what people would call sort of indigenous Hellenism. It's a different take on the legacy of Alexander the Great that links the antiquity with the maritime tradition of the Tales from the Prow. But I also became, I have to say, over the course of this, really interested in this notion of the sea as somehow a place that is more unchanging than the land, and therefore preserves vestiges, preserves antiquity in a way, like that what's down there still is ancient. And I think that the Gorgon really represents that. She's a holdover from antiquity who's still below the waves. If people are familiar with the story by the Italian story by Lampedusa, the siren, right there you have another Gorgon who is basically an ancient Greek woman who lives beneath the sea, and who sort of falls in love with the boy and teaches him really good ancient Greek, and he goes on and becomes a professor. And then you have also these sponge divers who, if you know sort of about, maritime archaeological goings on in Greece, it's often sponge divers who find the antiquities underwater. Sponge divers found the Antikythera machine. When the Elgin marbles, were shipwrecked, it was sponge divers who helped recover them. So there's a real sort of, the sea seems to be this place where antiquity is kind of still going on. as it were. And so I thought that the Gorgon was a nice bridge between the two works.
Yeah. Good. So are you ready for another question?
Sure.
Elias is asking, in addition to the statement, I can't wait to read it. He's asking, will the other works of Karkavitsas translated be included in the upcoming edition, the Log Exploris? And how do you see Karkavitsas' position towards the German influence on antiquities reception in late 19th century Greece?
So I'm only doing 4 of the sea stories. So it's the Gorgon, and then Calotychos, Fungarades, and Usury. I am not doing more because I think that as sort of finely wrought as these are, when you read too many of them, they can start to feel a little bit samey. And I didn't want to have that effect sort of detract from the what I think are really sort of show-stopping pieces of short fiction. In terms of the German influence in archaeology, I'll say very briefly that I think with my friend and colleague Byron McDougall, we sort of pieced together who the one particular philologist, Alamanos, the German in the Archeologist, we think of sort of an idea of who he's based on, which is Byzantinists and Neo-Hellenists who were in the milieu of the University of Munich in the 19th century. So I think that's all. I have quite a bit about this in the introduction, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so watch this space.
Yeah.
Johanna, I think it's time for you to read something from the Log Exploris. I am not going to ask for my favorite, so no pressure, but maybe read something that also posed a challenge for you in terms of the language.
Okay.
And we're all ears.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to read from Calotychos. This is a story that I've translated as the title is Doomed. And this is about a ship captain who loves the sea, but the sea doesn't love him back, shall we say. And the passage that I'm about to read, so one sort of nickname for Karkavitsas is the Joseph Conrad of Greece. And this passage depicts a snowstorm in the Straits. So the ship is coming back from Potamos from Odessa back to Galaxidi. And so they need to pass through the Straits as they're going through the Bosphorus. And they're a notoriously dangerous place. They're kind of like S-shaped and very thin, and there's very sheer cliffs on both sides. So they think that they've kind of, maybe evaded the captain's bad luck. But now the return voyage proves something different, and a snow squall crops up. So, and this story is told from the position of a sort of junior sailor on the ship. So the snow started coming down hard. It fell light on the deck, accumulated on the rigging, clung to the sails, and dissolved into the dark sea. The sky closed in, the other vessels disappeared, the straits vanished. They vanished from our sight, but not from our souls. We could all feel them looming around us, and the treacherous blizzard was driving our boat right into them. "We're done for," murmurs the secretary, who had turned bronze green. "Hush, what do you mean we're done for?" shouts Captain Dracospilos indignantly. At once his aspect changed. He had smelled the danger and was running to face it head on. His eyes flashed, his voice became fierce. Capless, with his hair behind him and his breeches bound at the waist, he grabbed the helm from the ship's secretary's hands. "Lower the sails, secure the boom," he commands furiously. The sails came down, the boom was fastened tight in its hoops. The blizzard was growing stronger. Gust after gust, it pressed in on us. It drove at the sails, swelling and stretching them in a dogged attempt to rend them asunder. And the waves below, murky and foaming, battered the prow of the Prantanassa and rattled her from seam to seam with a roar as if to say, "Run." And the ship, frenzied and trembling all over, ran. She bounded over the peaks of the watery mountains, plunged into their valleys, scaled their slopes, and groaned deeply. "Tighten the topgallants, tighten the mainsail, lower the flying jib." The captain was hurling commands as vigorously as an anchor chain, and the sailors ran to and fro, scurrying about on the masts. Their feet clung tightly to the lines. Like vices, their hands gripped the yards. Not a forestay was left. The topsails, the mainsail, and jibs were all still up. The boat was speeding wholly off course. What course? No one knew. Darkness had set in doubly and triply all around us. Where were the reefs? Where was the strait? where was the wind pushing us and where were the currents dragging us? No idea. All sense of orientation was lost. I'll do one more minute if people can hang in there. Okay. We have to heave to, Captain Dracosphilos says pensively now. There is nothing left for us to do but beat the ship to windward. He swiftly ordered all hands to come out and lower the mainsail, secure the boom, let out the jibs. Bring the wheel down slowly, he says to the helmsman with some hesitation. I raced to haul in the boom sheet. Got it. But the sheet, frozen in the snow, wouldn't budge. The second boatswain goes to sea to the mainsail, and devil be gone, the lee sheet comes unhitched and the mainsail starts flapping like a flag. How can we heave to? The ship is no longer listening to us. The forward sails fill and become stretched too tight. The captain lost his mind when he realized his powerlessness. It was as if he became possessed. 2 candles for St. Nicholas, he orders a junior sailor. The boy flew to the cabin. He lit the candles in front of the silver-bedecked icon of our patron saint. You, boy, why are you just sitting there? He motions at me from a distance. Go quickly to the deck stringer and tell us what you see. Today we either make our charge or we perish. I wrapped my arms around the mast and made it out to the stringer. My God, what should I look at? What should I tell them? I couldn't even make out a mast. Everything around me was dim, everything lost in the snowstorm. And the Pantanasa, in a frenzy, was still moving fast, as if the dry land were pulling her in like a magnet.
Wonderful. And we will not tell you what happens next, but it's not good.
Buy the book.
So we have a question from Byron. What a great finale. Thank you, Byron. What can we look forward to next, Johanna? What's the next project?
I don't know. I have no idea. But thank you, Byron, for the vote of confidence.
Okay, great. That was it in a nutshell. People are sending wonderful comments as we draw to the end of the time that we had allocated for today. And you can read this, Johanna, from your colleagues. Ilya suggests that you should consider an audiobook reading this.
That's great.
So we have got a few more minutes for another question. Vangelis?
Well, actually, something that Johanna mentioned, and that was whether there are any distinctions between the 3 foreign classicists or archaeologists. It seems that you've researched their background or their identities. I was struck because you mentioned a few minutes ago one of the 3, Alamanos, who seems to me more sympathetic than the other 2. And I wonder if there's any way of, whether you had any ideas as to schools of classics or archaeology, and whether Karkavitsas was indirectly positioning himself in relation to them, or whether he's positioning himself in relation just to the countries involved, Germany or whatever.
Yeah, I think he's so the other are Genovesos, who's sort of like an Italian energy off that, and then Perahoras, the sort of outlander, right, just someone foreign. And then you have Alamanos, who I think really represents that if you kind of go into the intellectual milieu of politis, who had been studying up in Bavaria, in Munich, where you have this emergent school of Byzantinists and Neo-Hellenists at this time, who are very kind of on board with the Zambelios, Paparigopoulos kind of view of the arc of Greek history. And I think that there is this sort of gesture to them. And it's a sort of interesting thing, though, because Aristodimos, his reaction to the book that Alamanos eventually produces, which is this grand synthesis, is how dare he, only a Eumorphopoulos could write Eumorphopoulos history, which I have to say is sort of like, a thing that struck a nerve with me as being a Xeni who has these pretensions now of, encroaching upon modern Greek territory. And so I think that sort of milieu is one that Karkavitsas is speaking to, these people from his own intellectual circle that he'd been introduced to via politis, quite specifically.
Can I just ask one other question? And that is, you mentioned ekphrasis. There are moments in your translation, some of the most sort of purple prose in the Archeologist, I find it in many of the the descriptions of the landscape. And it seems to me that the landscape is often described in terms that are very self-consciously trying to present, the visual in a way that seems to be suggesting that it's very important. I mean, we talked a lot about language and the importance of language and register, etc. But when I read a lot of Greek prose from this period, Visinos, at the end of the only journey of his life, many of these writers are also contending with visuality and a kind of regime of visuality. I know you referred to ekphrasis in relationship to the embroidery that that Elpida brings to the whole proceedings. I wonder if those issues of the visual and placing oneself in relationship to the visual are important in the work.
I think they're hugely important in the work because I think that in Archeologists in particular, and there are other really stunning moments of ekphrasis in Loget's Sploris, like for example in the Sponge Divers, when you get the underwater world is really spectacular. But I think that it's so important in Archeologists because your essential juxtaposition, and this is not like my skill as a reader, this is just very clear in the novel, is between the gendima, this embroidery of Elpida, and which is warm and vibrant and colorful and supple and pliant, all these kinds of things, and that hard, cold, gray, white stone marble. Right. That is what Aristodemos is after, right? And so he finds this statue that I again think is specifically informed. The statue that he finally excavates is informed by the discovery of the Acropolis, the Chori from the late 19th century that had been so sensationalized in the news. So I think that there is a lot of visual sort of elements of the ekphrasis, but I think that he is kind of trying to create this sort of multi-sensorial experience about the marble sort of coldness as opposed to the sort of sap present in Elpida's handicrafts, in Mrs. Panoria's body, in her embroidery. So I think that they're especially important in the Archeologist.
I would add to that, that the scenes where one or other of the characters, I can't remember who, looks out on the landscape and actually almost sees a kind of, this is the wrong use of the word, but a kind of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
That is, it looks the kind of sweep of the landscape with all the different peoples and their homes, and of course they all come back at the end. I mean, it's a work that is trying to chart a nationalist course, but it seems to me that it's also seeking some kind of melding.
Yeah, because you have that. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's extraordinary because you have these people that represent these different peoples, so the Serbs, Bulgarians, all these people, and Khan looking out from his palace. It's like time is very sort of telescoped in this, as is geography. So because all of the the new sort of nations that have been created by the Treaty of Berlin, they're agricultural like farms now, and they're Khan's neighbors. So he looks out and he can see all of them. And there are sort of two interesting moments, and I'll just say there's one at a wedding and one at a funeral, where you get what I think of as like the full cast. They all come together and interact with each other. All of these people.
Super spreader event.
Yeah.
Modern terms.
Yes.
Well, thank you both very much. We have comments that are coming in from the audience. Johanna Eleftheriou, who was our guest speaker. Hi, Johanna. On Monday, she said that she read Loget's Sploris in 1994. And in fact, Johanna, it was Loget's Sploris, believe it or not, was a set A-level text. What were those people thinking?
Who would have done such a thing?
Exactly. So Johanna says, what can we do to actually support the book's reception and contribute to giving modern Greek its rightful place in the American literary imagination? And I would suggest, off the top of my head, please include it in your bibliography, in your reading list for your courses. And Johanna, yes, I know this is why you read it, because I had something to do with it being in the A-level list, but the rest shall remain a secret.
I mean, can I just say that really quickly, one thing, and that's so wonderful to hear about Johanna and her experience and from her memoir. And I think that one of the extraordinary things about Greek literature, and I don't want to sound sort of exceptionalist or something here, but is that because of the course of Greek national literature, because of its sort of vicissitudes, I think that what I find when I talk to people in Greece who are Greek is a real affection for the national literature that I don't feel something analogous with here in the United States. And so where I'm going with this is that, for me, working on this project has really forged these incredible relationships with people that I've met along the way. So I'll just say very briefly that the sponge divers, their surname is Vangelis, and they're from Hydra, they're from Hydra. So I looked up, I said, is this a sponge diving family? Turned out no, but it's the Vangelis pharmacy on Hydra that's been there. And I wound up speaking to the current pharmacist whose grandfather was a friend of Karkavitsas's and had hosted Karkavitsas when he came to Hydra to learn the sponge diving terminology to research his story. So that's sort of one place. And so we actually spoke on the phone. And then the other place, sort of really interesting kind of course of this is that I woke up one morning a few months ago to see in my inbox, and I wasn't quite sure if I was awake, a message from Andreas Karkavitsas. And I thought that somebody was playing some sort of joke on me or, anyways, but the descendant of the author, a direct descendant, has, gotten in touch, and the family has gotten in touch, and they've been very supportive, which I think, is not always the case when translations are happening. So it's been really wonderful in terms of sort of forging networks of people around this author and around these stories, which are really beloved to a lot of people.
Thank you. So unless another question comes in the next 2 minutes, I will say thank you, Johanna, for this wonderful way to spend Friday noon, such a lucid, intellectually stimulated exchange. And thank you, Vangelis, for contributing to it. And on my part, I'd like to thank you both for being such wonderful colleagues, for doing so much for modern Greek studies at Brown. You have been instrumental in the organization of these webinar series, and I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have been able to do it without you, as well as the support of our chair of classics, who's also in the board, Graham Oliver, who is over there in the audience. So you'll be seeing us again in the spring webinar series. We have got some great things lined up for you. So please continue to log in and to be part of our, as I call them, our perambulations in the various fields of modern Greek studies.
Well, thank you, Elsa, and thank you, Vangelis, and Elsa, all you've done. You've raised really the heart and soul of this program to put all this together and bring all of us together. We really appreciate it. So.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe. It's a beautiful day here in Providence, so nice and sunny. Thank you.